Timestamps. Something we've been talking about throughout the previous videos was time zones and time zone information. We also talked about UTC and ISO 8601. So we know all about time zones, and we know how computers want to store time information linked to a date. We know the standard that it's going to use to do that. But when we talk about timestamps, the definition is way more simple. A timestamp is a date with a time and potentially time zone information. So a timestamp is a date with a time. And when we use timestamps, for instance, we do select now, we get back a ISO 8601 formatted string, potentially with the time zone information, depending on the time zone set in your Postgres installation. So timestamps are one of those things that we utilize in order to store more granular information about our date. Say you wanted to store the last time someone accessed their account, they logged in. Well, in that case, you would want to store the time zone information and the timestamp information in order to trace where it came from and when it happened. So timestamps are one of those things that you can use in very powerful ways, but you have to decide when and how to use it. And when it comes to time zone information, we want to understand exactly how Postgres handles this information. So let's take a look at that. All right, so here we are in Valentina Studio. And when it comes to timestamps, what we need to know is that how you decide to store your timestamp is of the utmost importance. So over here, we haven't really looked at the create command or the insert command or how to create tables and insert information. But because we're tackling such a heavy topic, I thought it'd be important to jump ahead and show you some nuances. Now, the create table command creates a table. And over here, you can see I'm creating a table time zones. And what I want to show you is the different ways you can store timestamps, because we know how to store dates. And we know that dates hold year, day, month. But when it comes to timestamps, you can hold so much more information. And so knowing that we have the ISO 8601 format and we have UTC, well, what are the different ways we can store timestamps? Postgres comes with two what we would call different ways of storing a timestamp. And over here you can see it. I have a TS, which stands for timestamp, and I'm storing a timestamp without a time zone. And I have TZ, which is a time zone column, and I'm storing a timestamp with the time zone. And basically what this allows me to do is store a timestamp with its time zone value. So let's run this command back. And basically now my table is created. So let me comment this out. And over here at the top, you can see I have an insert command. So now on the table I created, I want to insert some information. So I'm saying insert into the table time zones the following values, and the order you give them in passes it into the order of the columns as they were defined. So column 1, 2, 3, 4. The columns go in sequence. So the sequence in which the columns are created is the sequence in which the data will be inserted. So over here, you can see that I'm inserting two values. Into TS, I'm inserting timestamp without time zone. And for both, I'm inserting the year 2000, January 1st, at 10 o'clock, at minus 5 hours UTC, so Toronto time. So I'm 5 hours ahead. So this, in essence, would be 5 o'clock, right? And in TZ, I'm doing timestamp with time zone. Again, the same exact one. Now let's see what happens when I actually insert these values. So I executed that, and over here I have the selection. So let me run that back. And what I can see here is that when I select from time zones, I have the TS and the TZ. Now, one visual difference we can immediately see is that with the ISO 8601 format, these are formatted differently. Interesting. TZ has +00. Huh. What is that about? Well, we know that by default, Postgres stores things as UTC values. And we set up our session to always show us the UTC dates and times. Okay, so when we inserted with the time zone into TZ, right? We inserted with time zone. So over here we can see that, it's 3 o'clock. Excuse me, it is 3 o'clock because 10 plus 5 equals 3 o'clock, not 5 o'clock. I made a little pronunciation mistake there, but 5 hours ahead would be 3 o'clock in Toronto time. So this is indeed correct. With the time zone, 5 hours ahead from 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3. So it's 3 o'clock. So with the time zone, we're getting 3 o'clock. Okay, that sounds good. We're getting the time zone information and it's being offset when we insert it. But here's the nuance. You see how TZ has this extra information and TS doesn't? Well, when we created our table, we said TS is a timestamp without a time zone and TZ is a timestamp with a time zone. So the way that we declared our column had a lot to do with the way that the column stored the information. TZ stores the extra time zone information. TS does not. The second nuance that I wanted to show you is when we inserted timestamp without time zone, what we can see happen is that TS isn't storing the information with the additional time zone information, but also it didn't offset the time. It's still 10 o'clock. Interesting. So there's two sides to this. The way you decide that your column is going to store information decides how much information it's going to store. When we say without time zone, we're not going to store that additional information. But on top of that, the way that we insert information is also of the utmost importance. Because when we say timestamp without time zone, basically what we're telling Postgres is, hey, this -05 here, ignore that and act as if the timestamp that I'm giving you is already UTC, even if it isn't. And when we say timestamp with time zone, we're saying, hey, Postgres, this thing I'm giving you, it's in this time zone. So make sure that when you store it, because you're going to store it in UTC, make sure you take into account this extra information I'm giving you over here and you offset it back to UTC so that you're sure that you're storing the time I'm giving you correctly. So interestingly enough, when we define columns, we can define them in a way that stores more or less information. And when we insert timestamp information, we can insert it in a way that tells Postgres, hey, ignore the time zone or take into account the time zone and offset the time. Now, these are very specific nuances that may seem irrelevant, but when we work with time zone information, when we work with time-sensitive information, we always want to make sure that we're storing information correctly. And these little nuances can come back and bite you if, for instance, let's say you accidentally inserted all of the information without the time zone, and now everyone's information that was inserted into the database didn't take into account their time zone. Well, now you're going to have to go do a massive operation and figure out in which time zones which people live and go and offset every single date you have potentially. So always make sure that when you're working with time zones and time-sensitive information, that you're inserting it in the right way. Now the question becomes, do I use timestamps or do I use dates? Well, it depends on what you're storing. Depending on what you're trying to accomplish, you may want to utilize timestamps. But for the majority of the cases, we often find dates because the granular information that we require isn't really necessary. Now, I've worked on apps where time zones were of extreme importance, depending on where the user was in the world and if they were cataloging certain sensitive information in the medical space. It became extremely vital for the doctor to know, hey, when was this administered? Where was this administered? And at what time was this administered? Because it was medication. And so with things like that, timestamps are crucial. But then on the other hand, you have apps that use timestamps where they could actually be using dates. Now, it's easy to go from a date to a timestamp, and it's easy to go from a timestamp back to a date. but make sure that you pick the right one up front so that you always have the information you need. And with that being said, let's go dive into some date operators and start working with dates in a way that we can use to filter information and get back to supercharging our where clause know-how. Because Postgres gives us operators to help simplify dates. And so let's zoom into those. And just so you know, those same operators work with timestamps. They work against both.